She did not defect. She did not surrender. She did not get absorbed by the machine the way that every previous populist challenger to the Brussels establishment had eventually been absorbed, worn down by the slow, grinding pressure of institutional power until the fire went out, and what remained was a manageable partner who had learned to work within the system rather than against it. For 3 years, Giorgia Meloni wore the most convincing mask in modern European political history. She attended the summits. She smiled through the photo opportunities. She softened her language and presented herself to the world as a responsible and pragmatic European leader who had matured beyond the angry nationalism of her opposition years. Brussels relaxed. The establishment press declared victory. The globalist commentariat toasted to another dangerous outsider successfully tamed. But while they were congratulating themselves, Meloni was doing something none of them anticipated and none of them were watching for. She was building a case. 3 years of closed-door meetings with EU commissioners. 3 years of private conversations where the mask of institutional civility slipped and the raw mechanics of power were exposed. 3 years of documented evidence assembled by a sitting head of government with unprecedented access to the inner workings of the European machine. The recordings are real, the memos exist, and what they reveal about the institution that governs 450 million people is so fundamentally disturbing that the entire Brussels establishment is now scrambling to contain damage that may already be beyond containing. This is not a political scandal. This is the exposure of a system that was never what it claimed to be. And the moment Meloni opens that file completely, nothing about the European Union will ever look the same again. To understand the full weight of what Meloni has assembled and what she is now preparing to deploy, you have to understand where her understanding of what the European Union actually was beneath its democratic surface began. Not in 2022, when her Brothers of Italy party swept to power on a wave of nationalist fury that Brussels had told itself was a temporary aberration. The institutional machinery would eventually manage back within acceptable boundaries. Not even in the years of her firebrand opposition leadership, when she was thundering from every available platform about unelected elites and bureaucratic overreach and the systematic stripping away of national sovereignty from nations foolish enough to trust the project with their futures. Earlier than that, in the formative political years when a rising political figure was encountering the European institutional framework, not as an abstract ideological target, but as a concrete operational reality whose mechanics she was beginning to understand from the inside out. The institution she encountered bore almost no resemblance to the idealistic democratic partnership that its founders had sold to the world and that its contemporary defenders continued to present in the carefully managed public communications that the Commission's sophisticated press operation produced with the consistency of an institution that understood how much its legitimacy depended on the maintenance of a specific narrative about its own character. What she saw operating beneath that narrative was something colder, something more calculated, something that did not run on the principles of democratic accountability and mutual cooperation that the official description required, but on the older and more durable mechanics of institutional power whose instruments were fear, dependency, and the credible threat of consequences for those who chose to operate outside the boundaries that the people controlling those instruments had decided were acceptable. From the beginning of her political career, Meloni had been among the most uncompromising critics of the Brussels establishment, and her critique had never been the gentle reformist variety that suggested the project needed adjustment rather than fundamental challenge. She launched full-scale rhetorical assaults. She called the European Union a supranational structure whose purpose was not the liberation of European citizens, but their systematic management by an insulated class of technocrats who answered to no electorate and feared no democratic consequence. She warned about binding decisions affecting hundreds of millions of people being made without a single vote being cast by any of the people those decisions would affect. She described with the directness that made her audiences roar and made the establishment sneer the process through which the consolidation of power among the European institutional class was being advanced behind the progressive language of shared values and democratic solidarity. Brussels watched her with the cold, calculating attention of an institution that had dealt with troublemakers before and had developed across years of experience a reliable toolkit for neutralizing them before they could accumulate the kind of structural influence that would make them genuinely difficult to manage. The response to her 2022 election victory was immediate and revealed more about the institution producing it than about the political situation it was purportedly addressing. There was no congratulatory warmth, no expression of democratic respect for the clearly expressed will of the Italian electorate that had given her government its mandate. Instead, the response from the heart of the European project was something whose character Meloni burned into her memory with a precision that 3 years of subsequent experience would only sharpen. Ursula von der Leyen stood before cameras in the days before the Italian election and delivered what required no translation to understand as a threat directed not at Meloni's government, but at the Italian voters considering putting her there. If things went in a difficult direction in Italy, von der Leyen told the world, the European Commission had tools to deal with it, just as it had used those tools against Poland, just as it had used those tools against Hungary. The message was clear enough that it would have triggered international condemnation as an extraordinary interference in the democratic process of a sovereign nation if it had come from any other institutional actor in the contemporary political world. Because it came from Brussels wrapped in the respectable language of European values and the rule of law, the mainstream press largely processed it as an unremarkable expression of institutional concern rather than as the naked threat it actually was. Meloni did not process it that way. She burned every word of it into her political memory because in that single moment of institutional arrogance, von der Leyen had accidentally given her something more valuable than any opposition research or intelligence briefing could have provided. She had shown Meloni exactly what the European Union had become in practice beneath its democratic self-presentation. Not a voluntary alliance of sovereign equals engaging in cooperative governance towards shared goals. A hegemonic structure with the tools, the demonstrated will, and the complete institutional shamelessness required to interfere directly in the democratic processes of its own member states when those processes threaten to produce outcomes incompatible with the preferences of the people running it. It was the confirmation delivered in the most public and unambiguous form available of everything Meloni had been arguing for years, and it planted a seed whose flowering would take 3 years, but whose eventual bloom would produce something that Brussels had given her every reason to construct and no reason to withhold. What happened the moment she took office confused almost everyone watching because it appeared to contradict everything her political history had established about her character and her intentions. The transformation was sudden and so complete that observers across the political spectrum struggled to find an explanation that made sense of what they were witnessing. The woman who had declared open war on Brussels began shaking hands with Brussels. The populist firebrand who had thundered against unelected elites was sitting across tables from them, nodding politely, playing the diplomatic game with a smoothness that her critics on the right found deeply alarming and that her opponents in the establishment found deeply reassuring. She attended the summits. She smiled through the photo sessions. She softened her rhetoric and presented herself in the careful language that European institutional culture recognized as the vocabulary of a responsible partner who had made her peace with the system's requirements. Critics on the right screamed betrayal. Her base grew nervous. The international press published breathless analyses of her transformation from dangerous nationalist to pragmatic European leader. Brussels relaxed its assessment of her from existential threat to manageable partner. And that relaxation, it would later emerge with the devastating clarity of a plan whose execution had been flawless, was precisely the outcome she had been engineering. Because while the establishment was congratulating itself on having successfully absorbed and neutralized another populist challenger, Meloni was doing something they were completely unprepared for because it had no precedent in the history of how nationalist leaders had previously engaged with the European institutional framework. She was listening with the systematic attention of someone building a legal record. She was watching with the analytical precision of someone documenting institutional behavior rather than simply reacting to it. She was recording, filing, and organizing every closed-door meeting where the mask of institutional civility slipped and the actual mechanics of European power became visible. Every private conversation where veiled threats were delivered in the careful language that institutional actors use when they want the message to land without creating a documentary trail that could be used against them. Every quid pro quo where the language of European solidarity was quietly replaced by the language of compliance or consequences. According to sources within the Italian government, Meloni had instructed her closest advisors to maintain meticulous and legally organized records of every interaction with Brussels officials that crossed the line from legitimate political negotiation into what the documentation they were assembling would later support, characterizing as institutional coercion. She was not building a political career inside the European system. She was building an evidentiary case against it with the patience and the methodical precision that the case's eventual use would require. The migration crisis became the first major testing ground for what she was documenting, and the evidence it generated was both extensive and revealing about the gap between the Commission's public posture of concern for humanitarian standards and the operational reality of how it actually engaged with member states facing the pressures that Italy's geographic position made unavoidable. Italy had been absorbing extraordinary migration pressure across its southern coastline for years before Meloni took office, and had been communicating the scale and the urgency of that pressure to Brussels through every available channel, while receiving in return the combination of lectures about European values, bureaucratic obstruction of Italian responses, and the consistent message that Italy's situation was primarily Italy's problem rather than a European challenge requiring European solidarity of the kind that the project's foundational rhetoric had always promised. When Meloni's government proposed concrete approaches, including the Albania processing arrangement that attracted sustained international attention, the response from Brussels, according to her inner circle, was not the constructive engagement that the Commission's public communications suggested it was pursuing. It was systematic legal and bureaucratic effort to undermine every Italian initiative, regardless of its merits, because the initiatives were coming from a government whose political orientation made their success institutionally inconvenient. The migration experience was one thread, but Meloni's team understood it as part of a larger pattern whose full dimensions became clearer with each month of documented observation. The Green Deal mandates were strangling Italian industrial capacity, while Northern European economies with closer institutional relationships to the Commission's leadership were receiving accommodations and exemptions that the published framework did not formally provide for. The digital agenda was developing in ways that concentrated data and surveillance power in institutions whose accountability to elected governments was obscured by layers of technical complexity and institutional distance. Every major policy initiative emerging from the Berlaymont carried beneath its progressive language the same operational subtext. This was not partnership between equals working toward shared goals. This was the architecture of dependency constructed with the specific purpose of ensuring that any member state government that departed from institutional preferences would find itself economically constrained, politically delegitimized, and legally besieged by mechanisms that the Commission controlled and that the government under pressure had no equivalent capacity to deploy in return. The Le Pen verdict was the moment that transformed 3 years of patient documentation from a private intelligence operation into something that could no longer be contained within the strategic calculation of when and how to deploy it, not because the conviction itself was the most significant piece of evidence Meloni had assembled across those 3 years. The dossier she had been building contained material whose implications extended far beyond what a single French court ruling could establish. But because the Le Pen verdict was public, undeniable, and visible to every European who had been watching the continent's political landscape with serious attention, it provided the external confirmation of the pattern that Meloni's private documentation had been recording in ways that her evidence alone, however compelling, could not have produced with the same immediate political impact. Marine Le Pen had spent decades building her political movement through entirely democratic means. She had contested elections, built party structures, expanded her electoral coalition through the kind of sustained grassroots political work that democratic systems are supposed to reward with the opportunity to govern when the coalition becomes large enough. By early 2025, she had built exactly that. She was polling at levels that represented a genuinely realistic path to the French presidency. The democratic process that European institutions claim to exist to protect was on the verge of producing an outcome that those institutions found politically intolerable. And then a Paris court convicted her of embezzling European Union funds and banned her from holding public office for 5 years with a speed and a severity that stunned legal observers across the continent who were assessing the verdict on its technical legal merits rather than on the political context that Meloni was reading, with the pattern recognition of someone who had spent 3 years documenting exactly this kind of institutional operation. Meloni was not analyzing the legal arguments of the embezzlement charges. She was looking at the timing. She was looking at the target. She was looking at the devastating political consequences that had been engineered with a surgical precision that the coincidence of timing alone could not explain to anyone who understood how the European institutional machine actually operated beneath its procedural surface. The path to democratic power that Le Pen had spent decades building through entirely legitimate means had been legally sealed shut, not by voters making a democratic choice, but by a judicial process whose outcome had arrived at precisely the moment when it would produce the maximum damage to her electoral prospects and the minimum opportunity for democratic recovery within the political time frame that mattered. For Meloni sitting in the Palazzo Chigi and processing what she was watching, the Le Pen conviction was not a surprising development that required new analysis. It was the clearest and most public demonstration yet of something she had been documenting in private for 3 years. The European Union had developed what her documentation described as a shadow mechanism, an unofficial but devastatingly effective system of coordination between Brussels institutions and sympathetic judicial actors in member states designed to achieve through legal process what could not be achieved through democratic competition. If a politician became too dangerous, too popular, too threatening to the institutional project's continuation under the leadership of the people who currently ran it, the machine did not need to defeat them at the ballot box. It needed only to activate the right levers in the right courtrooms at the right moment, and the democratic threat would be neutralized before the election, where it could have been expressed, ever took place. It was lawfare, institutionally sanctioned, systematically deployed, and operationally sophisticated lawfare, whose existence Meloni had been documenting through 3 years of access that no previous challenger to the Brussels establishment had possessed in the same form or with the same methodical intention. And she had what she described to her closest advisors as the receipts. Her public statement following the Le Pen verdict was crafted with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment and understood exactly what she wanted it to communicate to the two very different audiences who would be receiving it simultaneously. To the general European public, it read as the predictable solidarity of one right-wing leader defending another against a judicial verdict that her ideological allies found politically convenient to criticize. To Brussels officials who understood the coded language of European political warfare and who had reason to know what Meloni had been doing during the 3 years of managed cooperation that they had interpreted as successful institutional absorption, it was something considerably more alarming. She spoke about democracy under siege. She raised the specter of political opposition being systematically criminalized rather than democratically defeated. She used language precise enough that the people it was aimed at could not mistake its meaning. She was telling the machine in terms that left no room for misinterpretation, that she had been watching, that she had been documenting, that she understood exactly what had happened to Le Pen, and that the conviction had not produced the effect that the people who had engineered it might have intended. It had not frightened her into silence or compliance. It had pushed her past the point of return. What followed in the weeks after the Le Pen verdict was a masterclass in the kind of controlled escalation that only a political operator who knows exactly what they are building toward can execute with the discipline that the strategy required. Meloni began making a series of carefully calibrated public statements whose content and whose language moved incrementally and deliberately toward the moment of full revelation without arriving there before the preparation was complete. She spoke at length about the erosion of national sovereignty in ways that went beyond the general rhetorical territory she had always occupied into the more specific and more evidentially grounded territory of someone describing a documented pattern rather than an ideological concern. She gave interviews where she raised questions about the independence of European judicial institutions, whose phrasing was careful enough to be deniable as general commentary, but pointed enough to communicate to informed observers that she was describing something specific. She began publicly connecting dots that Brussels desperately wanted to remain disconnected, drawing explicit lines between migration policy pressure and funding conditionality, between regulatory enforcement patterns and political alignment, between the treatment of compliant governments and the treatment of resistant ones in ways that the Commission's public communications had always been designed to obscure. The establishment's response to this escalating pattern followed with mechanical predictability the exact playbook that Meloni had been documenting across the preceding 3 years.